To God be the glory.
Welcome to our continued study of church history. What we've covered up to this point has been designated the early church history. In this lesson and the next one or so, I want to move is what we call the transition from the early church history to the medieval. That time is sometimes designated as medieval period of time, or sometimes you'll see it referred to as the Middle Ages, or sometimes you may even see it referred to as the Dark Ages. And like most dates in church history, it's not always easy to put an exact date. These dates also are kind of relative, depends upon who's dating them and to what point they're looking. Generally speaking, the Middle Ages, or the medieval period of time, covers between 500 and 1500. Now, sometimes we designate that from 500 to about 1300, but basically I usually use the date of 500 to 1500 to designate this period. In this lesson, I want to look at the events that went together to form the transition of going from this early church history into this Middle Ages period of time. In this lesson, we're going to look at a lot of movement of the barbaric peoples and tribes. The cycle of people coming out of Central Asia brought increasing pressure to the frontiers of the Roman Empire even as early as the 2nd century. And one of the things that I want to note at this point is this particular lesson will have more history than church history. But we need to understand what brought about the fall of the Roman Empire. And as we look at the events related to the fall of Rome, we then will begin to see some background material that relates to the rise of the papacy, that is, the rise of the popes. And so we need to spend some time looking at secular history to give us a background to understand church history. And so in this lesson, we're going to be looking at a great deal of just history, dealing with, as we've just mentioned, the movement of some barbaric tribes. They began to move out of Central Asia and moved over into what today would be mid-Europe, and began to settle there, and they began to create problems for the Roman Empire. A process of civilizations went on the frontiers, which led to many of the Germanic tribes even fighting on the side of the Roman Empire. And they were fighting against less civilized tribes who were coming into and invading this part of the world. But by the 6th century, most of the old Roman Empire in the West had been overrun by the semi-civilized Germanic tribes. That is, you see, by the 6th century, that would be in the 500s. Now, as we go through this study today, we will come to the point of saying that usually the date that's given for the fall of Rome is 476. Now, it's hard to put a particular date. Some put it earlier and some put it later as to when that event took place. When does a nation fall? Well, it may be in the process of falling a long period of time, and so when do you put a date? So we have settled in on the date of 476 for the fall of Rome. But by the 6th century, you see, in the 500s, most of the old Roman Empire in the West had been overrun by these semi-civilized Germanic barbarian tribes. But the empire continued in the east. Now remember, when we talk about the Roman Empire, it covers the world. But it basically was divided between east and west. In the west is Europe, Italy, Germany, France, Spain, that area. In the east, it basically is the territory from Constantinople eastward. It was a big empire and gradually became divided so that you have the east and the west. Well, what we're going to see happened is the west went through a period called the Middle Ages, the medieval period of time. The east did not go through that period of time. The east never had a Middle Ages, but it became the Byzantine Empire. And we'll look about that and give some details about that a little later on. The settlement of the Germanic invaders in Western Europe, to some extent, broke the link between the old classical civilization and introduced a new civilization called the medieval civilization. What I want us to look at now are the events that led to the fall of Rome. You know, the Roman Empire had stood for hundreds of years, and it's a major event that this empire fell, and particularly that the city of Rome fell. There were a lot of factors as to why that fell, and we're not really going into that part of history as to the circumstances that led to the fall. But we're looking specifically in this lesson at the details of that fall as we see it brought about by the invasion of the barbaric tribes. But in order to do that, we need to back up and begin to talk a little bit about the barbarian tribes and where they came from and where they settled and how they came to be an influence, a factor in the fall of Rome. As we go through this, I will be talking about various parts of Europe. It would be very helpful if you had a map of Europe, and especially helpful if you could find a map that portrays the movement of these barbaric people. You may find that in some of those encyclopedias or in some world history books, and it would simply be helpful to get this picture in your mind as we speak about various barbarian tribes. We're going to come across the names of several of them. Many of them are very similar. Many of them sound alike. Many of them moved through the same areas. And so if you could get a picture of that in your mind or on particularly a map that's in front of you, it'll help you understand this material more easily and more readily. So at this point, we're simply going to stop and say, okay, let's look at the movement of some of these tribes. First off, we'll begin with the settlement of Britain. Now, of course, these were settled by several barbaric tribes, the Jutes, the Saxons, and the Angles, who came to Britain from Denmark and the Denmark area. Now, they drove out the Celts from that area and drove them farther west. Now, we normally pronounce this Celts. You know, we talk about the Boston Celtics. But in reality, it is the Boston Celtics. And so that's who we're talking about. And they drove out those people. And of course, the Saxons and the Angles became the Anglo-Saxons. The American people come from those tribes. Another tribe that we need to mention is the tribe of the Goths. From the 3rd century, you see that's the 200s, from the 3rd centuries onward, the Goths had been making raids into the Danube frontier area of the Roman Empire. In the 4th century, the 300s, the Goths were divided among several different tribes. Here they are. Not only the Goths, or the broad term, then you have the Visigoths west of the river. You might pronounce it Dniester or Dniester, Dneister, a river that's in Russia. The Visigoths were west of that point. Then you have another group called the Ostrogoths, who were east of the Dniester or Dniester River. And these folks were in control of Russia. So you have the Goths, the broad term, you have the Visigoths, who are west, the Ostrogoths, who are east. Both of these were driven southward and westward by the Huns in 376. So as the Huns, coming out of farther part of the Asian area, drove these two barbaric tribes, drove them south and west into Europe. Now, the Visigoths first settled in the Baltic area, but later they moved farther west to the point of occupying what is now Spain and the southern part of France. Now, another barbaric tribe is called the Vandals. They came to be settled in northern Africa, and that's going to play a part as the Vandals come in and sack Rome in 455. We'll be looking at those dates a little later. Then another group are the folks called the Franks. They settled in northern France and Germany. Now, remember, at this time, Europe is not divided into these various countries as we see Europe divided or recognize it today. But this is the area as we would look at it on a modern map today. Then, in southern France, between the Franks and the northern Italy are the Burgundians. And then also the next group that we're going to mention are the Lombards, who were in Russia. Now, these tribes play a part in the movement of the settlement of Europe and the fall of Rome. The movement of the barbarian tribes played a significant part. Here are some of the facts about the movement of those tribes. The Goths made up the Germanic tribes and had a good bit of interaction with the Romans because of traders from several different Roman armies. And so the Goths kind of intermingled with the Romans, as the Romans are on the frontiers of their empire. Now, the frontier of their empire is the area of Germany and France and that area, northern Italy. Now, they were pressed in an invasion by the Huns from West Central Asia. The Visigoths, looking for shelter, crossed the frontier of the lower Danube River in 376. Angered and ill-treated by the Roman officials, they crossed the Balkans and annihilated the Roman armies near Adrianople in 378. It was in this battle that the Roman Emperor Valens lost his life in that battle. Now, the strong hand of Theodosius, who served as an emperor from 379 to 395, restrained their attacks. But on his death, when he died, he left his kingdom, his empire, to two very young sons. One of them, Arcadius, was 18 years of age. He left him in charge of the east. His 11-year-old son, Honorius, was left in charge of the west. Neither of these young men were able to resist the barbarian invasions. Now, there was a man by the name of Alaric, Alaric, who was the Visigoth. He plundered almost to the walls of Constantinople and then over into Greece. And by 401, these Visigoths were pressing into northern Italy, but were resisted for the next few years by Theodosius, general who was kind of in charge of this young son. And this general's name was Stilicho, whom he had left in charge because his son was so young. Stilicho was murdered in 408, and this opened the road to Rome, so that the Visigoths could come on in and attack Rome. Now, this happened basically through this man Alaric. He marched to Rome, but it was not until 410 that the Visigoth chieftain actually captured the city. So here's what we're looking at first off. We have a man by the name of Alaric, who is a Visigoth. And when the resistance dies in the form of this general who had been resisting the barbarians, when he dies in 408, this Alaric brings his men all the way to Rome, and they sack the city of Rome in 410. Now then, Alaric was desirous of establishing a kingdom for himself and of securing Rome's part in northern Africa, which was the granary for Italy. And so he marched at once to southern Italy. But when he got down to the southern part of Italy, he died. Now, another captain or leader of the Visigoth was named Ataulf, and he took this band of barbarians, and he became that new leader, and he marched those men back up north, and he invaded southern Gaul in 412. That's basically what we'd say the southern part of France and Germany. And here the Goths settled by 419 and developed a kingdom that included half of modern France, to which were added also Spain by conquest. Now the Roman inhabitants were not driven out, but they were subjected to the Germanic conquerors, who appropriated much of the land and who placed these Roman citizens under their rule. Now we want to, at this point, look at some other barbaric tribes and the movement of those tribes. While the events that were described above were taking place, the tribes across the Rhine had seen their opportunity, and they began to make their moves. And so you have the Arian Vandals and the heathen Alans and the Suevi invading Gaul at the close of 406. And ultimately, they pushed their way into Spain, where they arrived even before the Visigoths. Now, there's one phrase that I want us to look at there, and that is Arian Vandals. Now, with that word Arian, it is the same word that we looked at several times with regard to the theology of the belief of Arian that said that Jesus Christ was a created being. That's the doctrine of Arius, and the doctrine became the Arian doctrine. And what we're going to see, and we'll give you more details about it in future lessons, these barbarian tribes were converted to the Arian doctrine and view of Jesus Christ. Now that's going to become significant because what we're going to see, and we'll look at in greater detail, they were converted to the Arian doctrine, but later on were finally converted to what would be called the Orthodox view of Jesus Christ. That is, that He was deity, not the Arian view that taught that Jesus Christ was a created being. But at this point, we just simply want to note that this happened very early, and that these people are Arian in their view of Jesus Christ. Now this occurred in basically the 3rd century, in which they were Christianized with the Arian doctrine. Now, what we're going to look at now, the Franks had pressed into the northern Gaul, and the Burgundians conquered the regions around Strasbourg, and thus gradually the territory of eastern Gaul, which still bears that name. The Vandals from Spain, having entered Africa by 425, invaded it in full force in 429 under a man by the name of Gesseric, and they soon established there the most powerful of the early Germanic kingdoms, whose pirate ships speedily dominated all of Western Mediterranean. So what we have is, we have the Visigoths, the Vandals from Spain, who entered into to the northern part of Africa, and there they became very strong, developing pirate ships. They controlled that whole Mediterranean area. And then what we're going to see is that the Vandals moved on across, and they sacked Rome in 455. Now then, we're going to move in a little different direction in terms of talking about the part that the emperors played in connection with these barbarian tribes. By this time, we're talking about 350 to 400. Even though one was called an emperor, in reality, he was only a tool for the army. The Roman Empire is becoming so weak by this time that the emperor is almost, or basically, an emperor only in name. He doesn't really have any power. The power rests in the armies, and the armies select the emperors and remove the emperors and put in another emperor. And so the emperor has become a figurehead. We're going to see for these last several years that there was one emperor right after another, with none of them having much power. On the death of Honorius in 423, the empire passed to Valentinius, or Valentinia III, who reigned until 455. But his reign was marked by quarrels with leaders in other parts of the empire. So although he ruled for about 30 years, he really was not a very good ruler, and there was conflict throughout the empire during his reign. The last Roman victory by a leader of the Roman army was Actius, who joined with the Visigoths to defeat Attila the Hun, or Attila the Hun, in 451. That's the last victory that a Roman army enjoyed. Between 455, when Valentinian III died, and 476, no less than 9 emperors were set up and removed there in the West. So you can see the Roman Empire is falling apart. It is disintegrating. They don't have any real leadership. And I say that because that's going to be significant with the rise of the papal or Pope's power in Rome. In a sense, a little preview. What we're going to look at is this. When it comes time that Rome is going to be destroyed, it's not the Roman Empire, it's not the Roman emperors who saved the city, it's the bishop of Rome. And when the Bishop Leo saves the city from being utterly destroyed, this is going to raise the prestige of the Roman bishop in the eyes of the whole world, and especially the people in Rome. They're going to recognize that it's not the Roman Empire that saved them, but the church. And therefore, the church is going to rise in power. Now, we'll look at some of those details a little later, but that's where we're headed, and that's the significance of the fact that the Roman Empire is falling apart and that they don't really have any real strong emperors or strong leaders to guide this empire and protect this empire from this invasion. The real power behind the emperors were the people, the men who headed and led the armies. Between 456 and 472, this power was held by a man by the name of Ricimer, who of Suevic, a Visigoth descendant. Now, Ricimer was the power. Now, when he died, there was a man by the name of Orestes who took command. He bestowed on his son, Romulus, the imperial title. But the army demanded that 1/3 of the land be given to them. When this man Orestes refused to give in to the army rebelled. There was mutiny in 476 under this Germanic general. Odovaker was put in his place. And so when the armies rebelled against Orestes, they then, and that was in the year of 476, they placed in power a man by the name of Odovaker. Now, if you notice, what we looked at and what we said is this happened in the year 476. That's the reason that we usually look at that date as the date of the fall of the Roman Empire. There would not be another emperor in the West until you came to Charlemagne. Charlemagne lived between 742 and 814. And later on in a future lesson, we're going to give a great deal of detail about this man Charlemagne. He was a great ruler. He was the king of the Franks from 768 to 814. He was then emperor of the Roman Empire from 800 to 814. His name means Charles the Great. He became a key figure in the development of the Western Europe's medieval civilization. He became a significant figure in the development of the Western Europe's medieval civilization. By his almost constant military campaigns, he created a vast empire in the West, which included much of the western part of the old Roman Empire as well as some new territory. So what we're looking at is, you see, about 455, the last Roman emperor serves, and you're not going to have another emperor to rule in the Roman area or develop the Roman Empire until Charlemagne comes on the scene and is declared the emperor in 800. So you're going to go about 350 years without an emperor ruling in the world. And so you see, basically, the Roman Empire fell basically about 476 when the city of Rome fell. And then later on, Charles the Great, Charlemagne, is appointed the emperor of the empire. He was the first Germanic ruler to assume the title of emperor. The empire that he revived lasted in one form or another for about 1,000 years, from, you see, about 800 to about 1800. Probably no ruler of the early Middle Ages better deserved the title the Great than did Charlemagne. Now, jumping ahead, between 568 and 572, a new Germanic invasion took place, and that was by the Lombards. They were founded a kingdom that was to last 2 centuries. They mastered and conquered the northern part of Italy, to which region they gave their name, and it's still called the Lombard area. They did not conquer Rome and the southern part of the peninsula, but they played a great part in the future history and establishment of the church and church history in that region. Rome remained connected with the empire, which had its seat in Constantinople, but it was so far from the capital, Constantinople, that the Lombard frontier, that effectively they were cut off from Constantinople. Here's the idea. The Roman Empire, you remember, had switched its capital to Constantinople hundreds of years before. Constantinople is supposed to be guarding Europe, the Western Empire. But they are so far from Constantinople that Constantinople didn't do a very good job guarding it. And so what's going to happen is there is a division that's going to take place between the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. And so that's one of the reasons that these barbarian tribes could come into Italy, march down to Rome, and could have such a powerful effect, because basically the Roman Empire was weak. Rome is a long ways from Constantinople, and so they don't have the protection that they need. Now then, what we're going to look at in the next little section is the fact that these barbarian tribes were Christianized. Now this occurred in the 3rd century. By the 3rd century, the seeds of Christianity had been planted among the Visigoths. The nation as a whole was not converted until a man by the name of Ulfila, that's Ulfila, or sometimes you see it spelled Wulfila, worked among them. Here was a man who worked among these barbarian tribes. He worked to Christianize them. This man was born about 310 and came from a Christian background. In 341, he accompanied a Gothic emissary and was ordained a bishop by the Arian Eusebius, of Nicomedia, who was then Bishop of Constantinople. Now let's note something there again. You see, Eusebius, the bishop in Constantinople, was Arian in view. That is, he believed in the Arian doctrine that said that Jesus Christ was a created being. Now this missionary came to be ordained by this bishop, took his views, and this man went among the barbarian tribes up in what we would say is the central part of Europe, and he Christianized them. When he Christianized them, he gave them the Arian view of Jesus Christ. Now, it's going to take a long time, several hundred years, before those people in Central Europe changed their views from the Arian doctrine to the Orthodox doctrine. This man did a great job in Christianizing these heathen people. He translated the New Testament into the Gothic language for these people. And he died in 383 while visiting Constantinople. Now the Visigoths readily accepted this Arian Christianity, as did the Ostrogoths and the Vandals in part. Even the remoter Germanic tribes, such as the Burgundians and the Lombards, also, for the biggest part, accepted the Arian doctrine and the Arian view. Now, it's an interesting story as to how these people changed from the Arian view to what we would call the Orthodox view. And that's where we're going to take up in the next lesson. We're going to begin to see the events that changed these people from Arian Christians to Orthodox Christians as we continue to look at the events leading to the fall of Rome and the transition into the Middle Ages.